This story takes place roughly in 2000, when I was 5 years old. My parents lived in this 75-year-old brick house. Before we moved in, they were told that in the mid-1950s, a man had been shot and killed on the back porch. My little brother was 3 years old, and his favourite little toy car had a clown on top of it, and it would light up. This toy car would say, "Na na 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 na, boo, boo," when you pulled it back and then let it go across the floor. We shared a bedroom, and my mother would put his toy out of his reach at night so we could sleep. My father has worked the overnight shift at his job for 20 years, so at the time, my mum would take care of us while he was at work. She retells this story as, one night, the toy clown car rolled off the shelf and landed on the floor next to my bed. It rolled out into the living room and would roll right up to my mum, keeping completely silent until it was right in front of her. Then it would light up and go, "Na na 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 na, boo, boo," once to let her know it was there. She picked it up and took it back to our room, also to make sure we weren't out of bed. A few weeks went by without incident, but one night my mum was watching a late night rerun of I Love Lucy, and the toy clown car rolled out to her again. My mum just left the toy next to her, and it sat there with her and watched TV. This clown car would roll out to my mum every night after that to keep her company. Each night, the toy clown car would beep at her once to announce its presence. One day, she told my father about the toy, and he suggested they pull out the old Ouija board he'd been given by a stranger while he was stationed with the Navy in Japan. So they got out the proper precautionary tools to use the board, like white candles and then burnt sage after use. According to my parents, they talked to a man who had died in the house many years before and had not found a way out. He was making himself known as a kind of energy because my mum had been uneasy in certain places in the home, like the porch and the basement. As unbelievable as it sounds, they talked to the man in the clown car both on the board and would ask the car yes or no questions, 2 beeps for yes, 1 beep for no. They had a couple conversations with this man, finding out that he was the man who had been shot on the porch. Before they said goodbye on their 4th session, he told them he needed help and to dig a few feet down in the backyard next to the fence. The next morning, my father took a shovel and dug. He hit something hard and pulled out what he told us were the femur and tibia bones of a cow. To this day, I'm not sure what he did with them, and he tells me I made that story up. A few days later, on a Wednesday night, my mum was alone again on the couch watching TV. My brother's toy clown did not move off the shelf without my mum's assistance after that. My brother complained that his toy was now broken. My mum figured the batteries just needed to be changed. She opened up the bottom of the toy, and there weren't any batteries inside it.
I grew up in a pretty low-income town outside of a major US city. I never really had any friends until college, so in high school, it was just me and my girlfriend who lived in the same building as me. One night just before Halloween, I had knocked on my girlfriend's door to see if she wanted to go for a walk with me. I had just rolled a joint and thought it would be cool to check out our town all lit up and spooky, but to my disappointment, she wasn't feeling well and decided to call it an early night. So I decided to go it alone, and this wasn't the first time either, so I didn't have any speculation about it. It was about 12:30 a.m. when I got about a block down the road. I was well into my smoke and had just passed the last row of houses when I heard a noise coming from the alleyway. Like every time I'm baked, I assume it's a policeman and I speed walk into the tree line in front of me. When I did, under the dank glow of the streetlight there was an old man in a plaid suit and a bowler hat. He honestly looked like a cardboard cutout because he didn't move an inch, and even from about 15 yards away I could see his face. It was a bit shadowed from his hat, but I could make out a large grin on his face. It looked painfully forced and he looked diagonally into the cold night sky. As I stared down the sky from behind the shrubbery, his gaze suddenly fixated itself on the tree line where I was, and I stayed there frozen, wondering what the hell was going on. I've seen my fair share of crackheads and drug addicts, but this guy looked utterly insane. I just hoped to God that he wasn't looking at me. Something deep down in my gut told me to keep your distance from him, and in that moment, I felt a sharp pain in my fingers. I looked down. The joint burned to the mouthpiece and it was now cooking my fingertips. I let out a loud slur and quickly dropped the joint on the ground. Still in pain, I refocused my attention on the street corner where the man was. I guess my commotion bothered him because he began slowly walking in the opposite direction in a strange, on-a-wire-like stride. I took a deep breath, collected myself and exited the woods. The man was out of sight and I listened, his steps fading very gradually into the night. I sat down on the nearest stoop and pulled out a cigarette to calm my nerves, but before I could even light the damn thing, I hear in the dark street ahead of me quick footsteps and a voice, "No, no, no. No, no," and there he was running straight at me, his face cocked into a crooked angle, screaming. I dropped all of my shit and just ran. I have never run so fast in my life. I didn't bother looking back, and when I got to my building, I shut the door and ran upstairs. Like a kid after a scary movie, I went straight to my room and locked the door behind me. I checked out the window. Everything seemed normal until I heard the familiar tapping of his dress shoes. Not a moment later, he was there, in front of my building. The man looked up at me and took off his cap as he was saying hello. He then put his cap back on and walked toward my building door. The angle I was at was incapable of seeing people at the front steps, but that wasn't necessary, because soon enough I heard the door downstairs being opened and a slow but heavy step making its way up the stairs. My door handle jiggled, and I began sweating bullets. I looked out the window to think of how to escape, but this was pointless. I was 3 stories high. I ran to the door and held it with all my strength. Needless to say, I have never been so terrified in my life. After only a few seconds, the door stopped moving, and I collapsed in front of the door in exhaustion, drifting off to sleep. The next morning, I woke up in my bed with the door wide open. I jumped when I woke up, because from the point I fell asleep to when I woke up felt like a millisecond. Everything was normal. The sun was up, and I could smell breakfast downstairs. I went outside to have another smoke, and on my way down, I had convinced myself that it was a dream. That was until I opened the door and saw a bowler cap on the doorsteps to my apartment. I call him the gentleman.
My dad was the coolest guy on the block, probably because he was one of the 3 black dads who lived in our town. The population is around 98% Caucasian, and that's not an exaggeration. He was a state police officer, intimidating, wore Oakleys before the hipsters, and was generally a rough-sounding person. Damn, do I miss him. But the one thing he feared the most was Halloween. He would tell my sister and I stories at night about his life when he was in high school in Slum, New Jersey, and that every Halloween, crazy things would happen. He may have been pulling our legs a bit, but we didn't care. When Halloween would roll around, he would take us out while Mum stayed at home for the trick-or-treaters. One night, in 5th grade, Lexi and I were dressed as a witch and 50s poodle skirt girls. Dad held our hands, walking to the last street, when I realised I'd lost Mum's scarf. She loved that thing, so we walked all the way back towards the darker corner of our street. It's by the woods and a small stream, but when it's dark, you can't see anything. Dad said he'd seen something and walked towards it. When he got there, he was staring at something in the dark that we couldn't see. Lexi called out to him if he found Mum's scarf. He told her to be quiet and started crouching down, looking in the distance. For several moments we stood there, waiting. I could make out the scarf above his head, tied to a branch. He grabbed the scarf tied, still staring in the dark. He started backing away. Then Dad screamed and sort of shuffled backwards. It was a low, throaty scream like he was furious. He was swearing too, but I don't remember what. Whatever Dad had been staring at then bolted out of the trees and ran down the street, opposite of where we lived. It was a little child, probably a boy from his silhouette shape, in a black costume with skeleton bones on the front and a skull mask. When Lexi and I tried to go over and see what happened, Dad yelled for us to stay back. He got onto his ancient cell phone and called Mum to come pick us up. His next call was to the local police. We left before we could see anything, but the next day, Mum told us about the dead, skinned animals that had been found. By the time us kids could go look, they'd taped the whole place off and taken out the bloody animals. But there were stains on the pavement and the smell was pretty bad. The kids talked about it in school for a little while, and I was curious if they ever caught the boy. Nothing came out in the local papers though, and it was quickly forgotten. Eventually, Dad could have told me more, but it was the last Halloween we'd ever spent together. But I do remember him and Mum arguing for the next couple of days about never letting us go trick-or-treating again.
One time on Halloween night, my wife and I took our 1-year-old out trick-or-treating. Afterward, we went home and put the baby to bed. I hung out for a while, answering the occasional doorbell and doling out candy, and as the traffic died down at about 9:30, I told my wife I had to go out to work for a bit and finish up some stuff. So I left to work, and shortly after 11 p.m. my wife called and asked if I would be coming home soon. I could tell something was wrong by the tone of her voice and by the fact that she never calls to see if I'm coming home soon. I asked her about it and she said it was nothing, that she was just wondering, and me not believing her, came home right away. Apparently, at about 11, the doorbell rang. My wife's first thought was that it was a bit late for trick-or-treaters, but then figured maybe I forgot to turn out the porch light before I left, and it was just a handful of teenage trick-or-treaters out hitting up the last few porch lights still on. So she got up figuring that she would just divvy out the rest of the bowl to them and turn out the light. So she grabs the bowl of candy off the table and walks to the front door and looks at the light switch and sees that the light outside is out. So she gets mad, sets the bowl down, and plans on chewing the kids out about how the porch light is out, It's 11 p.m. We have a baby sleeping and blah blah blah. So she opens the door, and instead of finding kids, she sees a man standing on the top steps staring at her. He has plain old regular clothes on, no costume. My wife says, "Can I help you?" He stares right at her and says, "Trick or treat." "Excuse me?" my wife replies. He says it again, "Trick or treat." But this time he appears to be looking behind her as he says it, looking into the living room. For what? Maybe to see if there is anything worth stealing? Maybe to see if she is alone in the home? We don't know. My dog, a 110-pound black Labrador, who had walked in the middle of the living room floor by this time, immediately starts growling. My dog is a friendly dog, who, aside from always giving a stranger or the mailman 1 or 2 barks to announce that this is his territory, has never acted aggressively against a person or dog before. So when hearing him growling behind her, my wife turns and glances at my dog for a second. She said the dog was standing in a wide stance. His tail looked as bushy as a raccoon's, and his coat from the back of his ears to the back of his shoulders was so on end it looked like a mane. She said his teeth were bared so badly that you could count every one of them, and my dog maintained complete eye contact with the man. Our baby pulls his ears, pulls his tail, pokes his eyes, hits him with toys, and if I knew this dog could look this mean or aggressive, I would have never trusted him around our baby before. The man stared at our dog for a moment, then walked backwards down the steps and quickly walked down the street. My wife shut the door and locked it, and sat down on the couch thinking about what just happened. My dog never moved from the spot, but sat down at full attention and stared at the door for 2 or 3 minutes, as if he believed that it was part of his job to make sure he was ready if the man returned. The dog never broke eye contact with the closed door. After about 3 minutes, he walked over and laid at her feet. She said the man was creepy, but it seems like despite the odd behavior of the man, the dog seemed to know something right off the bat that my wife didn't.